Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're in the Americas. Welcome to OAG's latest webinar. I'm Becca Rowland and I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. We had some good news here in the UK this week. We're finally able to entertain some of our friends in our homes, and we can hug our family and friends. So the latest adaptation we're having to make in our personal lives, and this time it's a good one, it's a positive one. Aviation, like everything else, is continuing to have to adapt, sometimes positively, sometimes less so. And so, as usual in our webinars, we're going to be looking at the industry, seeing the changes that are happening, seeing how the industry is adapting. And today in particular, we're going to be focusing on airports and how airports themselves and that ecosystem of businesses that are based around airports and depend on the airport activity are also adapting. We're going to be starting, as usual, with a look at the OAG data, what it's telling us about the market, current capacity, and so on. We're going to be looking at market signals of market demand. We keep being asked about market demand, asked where assumptions are being made about pent-up demand. So what's actually happening, where markets have opened, where we've seen travel bubbles, what's actually happened, and what sort of inferences can we make about the future and what might happen in other parts of the world. As I've said, we're going to look particularly at airports and how they've been affected and how they're having to adapt to changes in who the travelers are that are using them, and how they're finding new revenue opportunities. We know that mostly in these afternoon webinars, we focus on Europe and the Americas as being sort of major markets, but there's always a few people who want a bit more about Africa. And so today we're going to be looking particularly at Africa, and it's really great to have a guest panelist with us from Cape Town. You will get access to the webinar afterwards, as usual, and please do use the chat to ask questions as we go through. We typically take the questions now as and when we can. We weave them into the conversation as much as we can. So it's a bit less of having questions at the end. So do keep your questions coming as we work our way through this. So our panel today, we're very pleased to have David King with us, who's project manager for Cape Town Air Access. And David, Cape Town Air Access is part of WESGRO, isn't it? So you're not here representing Cape Town Airport as such, but you do work on the air service development for the airport. Could you explain a bit about your role and how WESGRO and the airports company in South Africa and how the Cape Town Air Access initiative all sort of worked together and came about? Because it's a pretty good story, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Becca. Yeah, just a little bit of background on Cape Town Air Access. We were formed in 2015 as part of a provincial initiative to drive route development for specifically Cape Town and the Western Cape. So you have to work with AXA because AXA is the state-owned entity that runs all the airports in South Africa, and they are therefore one of our key partners. When we started, they didn't really focus that much on route development, although through the years that we've been busy now, they are also now creating entities for other airports in South Africa, and it's all because of the success that we've experienced during the last 5 years. This is quite a unique collaboration. We have 6 government entities that work together to form Cape Town Air Access. It is housed, as you said, in WESGRO, the official tourism, trade and investment promotion agency for Cape Town and the Western Cape. So they are in the business of promoting the destination worldwide, and we fit well into that, into that sphere. And it also, helps us a lot having access to, tourism and trade companies and people within Cape Town. So the project has been fairly successful. In the last 5 years, we've added 19 new routes and 23 route expansions to the Cape Town airport, bringing in many more tourists and doubling the airport capacity. So the project's been doing really well, and we just we're now focusing on the recovery and getting airlines back into Cape Town.
It's a really great story and a very interesting model of how to do air service development. So anyway, it's good to have you with us, David, and I'm looking forward to your insights about South Africa and Cape Town and the wider continent as well. As usual, we also have John Grant, resident expert analyst at OAG. John, your insights, as always, are useful and helpful, and you've been guiding us through the past year. But I gather you're still peering into your crystal ball to work out whether you can get to Australia next year, aren't you?
Yeah. Hi, Becca. Yes, you're so kind. You know, I'm still waiting for my hug from this morning, so fingers crossed it will happen. But yes, what are we, 15, 16 months into this prison sentence, and we've got to find a way out.
It's feeling that bad, is it, John? You've obviously had a long day already.
Yeah.
So let's start by looking at some of the OAG data that we usually start with. This is a chart showing global capacity as of this week, so the week of the 17th of May, that's the yellow line, and the dotted yellow line here is what's in the schedule for the rest of the year. So at the moment it's still looking, I should say the black line is 2019 and the grey line is 2020, and somehow the legend has got missed off. My apologies for that. We've had a little uptick this week, haven't we, John? We've just seen a little bit more global capacity than we had for the previous 4 to 6 weeks, which were really pretty flat.
Yes, we have, partly driven by the reopening of the United Kingdom international access, and despite the green lights and approval for people to go to Portugal without quarantining on return, there are more seats to Spain this week than there are Portugal, so go figure what's happening there. It's very strange. But as we keep seeing, Becca, you know, the challenge for the industry generally is to get a consistent momentum of forward-looking capacity. So, you know, we've seen some more US domestic traffic being added back, quite a bit of traffic in Western Europe, a little bit in Africa, but at the same time, of course, we then have the latest COVID spike in India and the downturn in capacity there. So you know, we are, every minor bump along the road seems to be exaggerated when we look at these numbers. And of course, airlines have as much visibility about the future as you and I. You know, they're getting no guidance from the airlines, from the regulators. There's no consistent policy being projected from global organizations. And airlines are now, or consistently, taking capacity out at between 4 and 6 weeks before the scheduled date of operation, which really leads us to that conclusion you said at the beginning. You know, it's been pretty flat. We don't think that those current capacity levels for July are likely to be realized unless there is a significant movement in the relaxation of quarantines, lockdowns, and travel protocols. And you know, what we had, I think, all hoped for at the beginning of 2021 as a summer of strong demand and positive cash flow for the airline community is being frustrated. And you know, we are within weeks, I think, of ending up in a poor summer season again, with the subsequent pressures on the industry going into winter 21/22.
Yeah, this feels very similar to where we were. Everything you've said feels like this could have been May last year. You know, airlines taking capacity out 4 to 6 weeks ahead of the schedule, getting a little bit close to the summer to still be holding hopes that it'll be the, you know, what we all hope for, and really expecting to see this dotted line come down quite a bit. You know, come down to here or so. It's a difficult time, isn't it? Let's have a look at the regions in a bit more detail. So this is the last 12 months with capacity versus the same month in 2019. So it's all against 2019. One day we'll stop comparing to 2019, but I think we're some way off that yet. So as of this month, global capacity is now 42% below where it was in 2019. Still lots of variation between the different regions, but they're moving in slightly different directions. So Europe, we've got a bit more capacity this week. Asia is a bit less, but the Asia figure is really about India, isn't it, John?
Yes, it is. And it's good to have David with us today in the context of Africa reporting its best performance versus 2019 in the last 12 months. So, you know, there's clearly some positivity there and things are moving forward. Europe has again, you know, it's just moved to the right side of that minus 30% mark. So that's helpful as well. But there are, you know, real pockets, and some markets are quite strong. The US domestic market has been phenomenally strong over the last couple of weeks. You know, in the Southwest Pacific and specifically Australia, stroke New Zealand, we've had the benefit of the Tasman bubble, and we'll see how that's worked or how it hasn't worked a bit later on. But it is, if we could just grasp some of these opportunities and we could move them forward and accelerate them forward, then I think everyone would be in a better space. And of course, to answer a question from Milan already, you know, this is capacity. We know demand is lagging capacity by anywhere between 15 and 20%. And we've seen some booking data from some major markets in the last couple of days that would indicate that the booking activity is 90% below 2019 levels in some key country-to-country markets because of the uncertainty. And, you know, people have quite frankly been burnt once with buying a ticket and ended up with a voucher and the difficulties of refunds. So consumer confidence has been severely rocked, and is something that we need to think about when we message the recovery and what is happening.
I think it's difficult, isn't it? We often get a question about, you know, why look at capacity rather than booking data. I guess there's issues of timing, that the booking data generally comes in a bit later. But I think we were talking in the last week, weren't we, about a concern, certainly in the UK, that from the travel industry, that many people may be holding multiple bookings. They've got an international booking and they've also got a domestic booking. And if they can go overseas, they will. But if they can't, they're holding one in their back pocket. And given that there's so much flexibility about cancellations and refunds now, people can choose to do that in a way perhaps they didn't before. We have no idea what the scale of that might be at this point in time, but I no data set is perfect, is it?
No, and I think it's going to become an increasing tactic since a couple and their story of their 2 holidays being booked has appeared on the front page of the BBC News website this afternoon. So, you know, everyone will think, oh, that's not a bad idea, and will jump on the bandwagon. And that is going to make it harder for airlines in terms of revenue management. You know, if half of the bookings that people, or from a small group, half of those bookings are never going to be realized, then managing the revenue management parameters is going to be even more challenging than it is today, when leisure passengers are booking at less than 2 weeks notice and the business segment has vanished off the face of the earth.
And without wanting to give a plug for any particular airline, Ryanair, I got an email in my inbox this morning from Ryanair offering a choice of many different flights for £5. Well, for £5, I could book a flight, and actually it's almost neither here nor there whether it, you know, if I lose money or not. So yeah, there's issues with bookings. David, let's bring you in here. So we're seeing some slightly more positive numbers from Africa here. Do you want to give us a sort of an update of how you see travel sentiment on the African continent and how airlines might be responding? I know you're more involved with the South African market, but I guess you keep an eye on the whole continent.
Yeah, I think what we've seen regionally, looking at the South African traffic and specifically Cape Town, is that there's quite a big uptick in well, flights and, you know, demand and supply of flights into the region. So I'm sure that this, you know, this is a trend throughout the whole of Africa. It's also interesting, just coming back to what you mentioned between domestic and international traffic for Cape Town. It's, you know, our picture is, I would say, a little bit weird because, you know, South Africans aren't really allowed to travel anywhere currently. So we have to stay in country, and we're seeing this in our domestic figures. I mean, we've got for the first 2 weeks of May now, we've got a 66% recovery in passenger traffic domestically, and the ATM recovery is 65%. So that's actually right on par with, you know, with supply and demand. Unfortunately, on the international side, the picture is much, you know, much worse, and we've only seen a 18% recovery in traffic compared to 2018, although the ATMs are at 40%. So that's following your trend of, you know, it's almost double what the passenger recovery is. And I think that's basically the picture for, you know, most of Africa as well.
Yeah. Okay, let's have a look at some particular countries. Oh, sorry, no, we'll stay with the regions, but we'll look at the last 8 weeks. So again, this is comparing to the same week, the equivalent week in 2019. A similar sort of pattern, but you just see a little bit more granularity here in terms of changes week over week. So quite a nice increase in Europe. I mean, it's still the worst performing region on this basis, but that's, as we've said many times, because so much of the traffic is international. But there has been a bit of opening this week, which is positive for many of us.
And some positive messaging, I think, around Africa generally, you know, to have gone from 5 weeks ago to minus 50%, down to minus 43. I mean, every seat is another service, another potential passenger, and, you know, a part of the recovery process. So hopefully we can hang on to that and keep moving in the right direction there.
Yeah. So now we'll look at a few countries. This is just a list of countries that OAG report on each week on their dashboard. They weren't the biggest countries pre-pandemic, but they are amongst the largest, and it's a good representative mix from around the world. So I think one of the interesting things here is, you know, in the past we've seen the US has been a larger market in terms of capacity than China, and that's not been the case since all of this started happening. But the US is catching up, isn't it? It's been very buoyant in the last little while, and it's close to being.
It is, and in some countries, Becca, what we're seeing here, of course, is the data we're showing is the combined international and domestic capacity.
Yes.
So, you know, you can see in the United States that minus 25 is all about international, and the lack of international capacity that is there compared to previous years. Domestic is, you know, doing really well at this moment in time. Lots of new routes, 2 new airlines starting in the at this week and the week after. So lots of good stuff there. China's flipped, pivoted, lots more capacity domestically. And then you look at Australia, it's minus 31. Again, that is all international capacity, because their domestic services are now performing strongly. But the dilemma for not just these countries, but every country, I think, and every airline, and indeed every airport, because it's important for airports, is that the international passenger generally pays maybe 2, 3, 4 times more in terms of an airfare, and you know, gives the airline a better yield. And from the airport's perspective, if you ever look at the difference in fees and charges between a domestic and an international passenger, and the retail spend of an international passenger versus a Starbucks and maybe a muffin with a domestic passenger, then until the international recovery gathers pace, these airlines and airports that are resident in these countries are just turning over cash, being a little bit positive on cash flow, but they're not making the profitability they'll need to repay some of the debts they've built in the last few years.
Yeah. Okay. One of the things I said at the beginning was that, you know, we have a lot of talk of pent-up demand, and a lot of assumptions that there is pent-up demand, and sometimes we're a bit short of evidence. So it's always interesting when we can look at a market that's open and see what's happened. So on the left here, this is the Tasman bubble, the Australian-New Zealand traffic. And it was in the first week of April that it was announced that there would be a Tasman bubble and people could travel again. And what we see when we look at the OAG traffic data, we can take a snapshot of the schedule at particular times. So the black bar here is as it was in February for traffic bookings, unadjusted bookings for the months May to September. And then the grey is in March, and in the yellow is in April. And we see this very significant jump in bookings, which would indicate there was a lot of pent-up demand. We'll come to another slide with a slightly different view perhaps, but looking at this, it would appear that there was a lot of people who were ready to book as soon as they could, which bodes well, I guess, for other places looking to create bubbles.
Yes, yes and no. I mean, it is all about messaging, and you know, the problem with the Australian, the Tasman bubble, Becca, has been that the both governments and indeed state authorities have made it very clear that they reserve the right at a day's notice to close down the bubble. And what we saw in May, I think, is that huge pent-up demand, people who'd got visiting friends, family, you know, sons and daughters who'd been trapped on the wrong island or the wrong, needed to get home, being repatriated. And that confidence is being knocked out of the market. And it's about the messaging that takes place. Now, compare that to Greece, where throughout, I think, summer 2020, all of the Greek islands remained open, and they made it very clear that they were still open for tourism. And, you know, this year they've adopted a very consistent message that they will remain open, and that it's business as normal. And therefore, whilst one of those booking curves is going down, the further out you look, the other one is actually getting stronger as you head into the holiday season and the peak season. And the messaging is absolutely vital. And to answer a question from Estelle, what are your views on the impact of a traffic light system?
I knew you'd love that question.
Yeah, I could have. Yeah, my view is it's a disaster. It is, if people cannot consistently message and say the same thing within government, within our leaders, what hopes do the airlines and the airports have of being able to comply with those sort of things?
Yeah, John, I think just to butt in there, I think I agree with you 100%, because we actually had, I mean, we can be a case study, because when South Africa opened in October, we had this red list of countries that couldn't travel, and then some of the countries were left off on the messaging, and then some were put back on, and no one really knew who could travel and who could not. And that, I mean, that just kills any hope of getting people to fly. And then we had a revised list, and then suddenly we went back into a bit of a lockdown. So you need to be consistent.
And I think, Becca, you know, from the perspective, you know, I'm not advocating this at all. Let me say that straight away. But if you've ever looked at the border between Spain and Portugal, it is extremely porous.
Okay, well, so I said we had another slide that gave a different take on the Tasman bubble, and this is it. It's a little confusing perhaps to start with, but using the schedule snapshots that we can look at from OAG data, the grey line here is what was in the schedule for each week up to middle of August, back at the beginning of April, so before the Tasman bubble was announced. And then the following week, lots of capacity added. We saw a big jump in capacity for, especially through April and May. But since then, it's fallen back. And as of this week, 17th of May was Monday, which is the sort of start of the week from an OAG point of view. The capacity is now lower than it was before the Tasman bubble was announced. So I think this plays it's exactly what you were saying, John. It's about confidence. It's about people who needed to travel have been able to, and they've taken advantage of that. But the market looks at the uncertainty associated with either side being able to stop this bubble operating at any point, and the risk of getting stuck somewhere, and it's not opening a travel bubble isn't enough to give the market confidence, is it?
No, and this is also a function of, at the same time as you open the bubble, the Australian government puts a very aggressive domestic tourism campaign out there, where essentially airfares are being subsidised. And as a consequence, airlines are looking at their expected bookings and the risk attached to flying to and from New Zealand, and thinking, well, I might as well fly an Australian domestic sector, because I know there's going to be demand. The chances of a lockdown or some short-term cancellation is very low. And it's just, these are the frustrations airlines are having to live with, and the minefield they've got to try and tiptoe through towards recovery. Very, very difficult.
Yeah. Okay, so we said we were going to talk about airports, so let's move on to some airport data. This is quite a busy slide, but you'll get it afterwards and can look at it in more detail then. We've got 4 charts just going back to March 2019 through to February with traffic data this time. So this is OAG passenger booking data rather than capacity. And just for a number of airports, these ones are some of our larger European airports. These are some of the larger Middle East and African airports, and then we've got some US airports down in the bottom left and some Latin American airports in the bottom right. Very similar pattern throughout, a little bit more positivity perhaps for some of these airports in Latin America, but these show, don't they, just the scale of the impact of the pandemic on airports. And these are this is an industry worth, we haven't got the number on here, we had it this morning, what was it, $288 billion a year?
Yeah, ACI numbers, and we're at 63 billion in the last year, so a 2/3 drop in revenues. But it just, Becca, these numbers, we're not looking at airlines, we're looking at airports, but obviously it's a function of the same event. And the revenues have just collapsed for these people, and it then hits the whole ecosystem. It is as much the WH Smiths as it is the duty-free tax retail concessions, the taxi operators, all of the airport hotels, and the fuel suppliers. So everyone has been as badly affected. Now, some airports are able to flip and do other things. Some have been very creative. But for many airports, and particularly those that are, have been state-owned and, for want of a better word, are institutionalized, having the creativity to look for new commercial revenue streams can be quite challenging. It's not what they were not set up to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, I think, similar in South Africa. The last flight I actually took was in February 2019 to Harare in Zimbabwe, and already then, even Joburg, because at that time we didn't really know what we're dealing with. But even at that time, the Johannesburg International Terminal was a ghost town. There were more staff in the shops than passengers or people that wanted to buy. So and I don't think that's changed significantly during the last year and a half. So, well, 2 years now. So year and a half. So it's disheartening. But I think what AXA has done well is that they have managed the crisis relatively well in terms of getting passengers back in a phased manner and making sure that all the protocols are in place. It started with just passengers, and then when they allowed meters and greeters back, the retail also opened, which at least created some footfall in the airport. And they also made deals with most of the retailers in terms of the rental agreements to at least bring it down, and I think that's what most of the airports had to do to manage this crisis. Otherwise everyone would have just closed shop.
Well, David, it's interesting you say that, because in Europe there are You know, there's been an interesting discussion between Heathrow and the Heathrow operators about the recovery of revenues that Heathrow have lost, and you know, they went to the regulator seeking a larger than normal increase to offset the revenue losses they had. I think they didn't get very far with that argument. But also Eurocontrol, who've lost significant amounts of cash because obviously no one's flying and there's no en route charges through European airspace, have already indicated that they will be putting up their charges from 2023 onwards to recover the revenues lost. You know, it seems like not everyone wants to be in the same bucket trying to sort the problem out as a collective industry, and some people are trying to make short-term gains.
Yeah, I mean, it's another difficult situation in South Africa is that the airports are regulated, so the charges, the landing fees, passenger charges, everything's regulated. So you know, although the airline fraternity lobbied for reduction in charges, the only thing that AXA could do was freeze the charges for a short while, making sure that it doesn't increase. And we've also seen increases now, but it was based on what was approved by the regulator. So yeah, it's a bit unfortunate. I mean, I'm sure the airlines would have loved some kind of reduction in fees. But what they also did to almost make sure that things are used optimally is, especially at Cape Town, they closed one of the parking garages and they only had one open, so the staff complement only needed to focus on a certain amount of space. So I think that also helped in managing the crisis better.
Yeah, we will come on to look at some of the things that the airports are having to do, and different. They're clearly, some are more hampered than others in terms of what they can do, particularly depending on whether they're regulated or not. This is just a look at another way of looking at airport capacity for 3 years for the month of May, 21, 20 and 2019. On the left, we've got the international, and on the right, the domestic, just to see, where the airports are. This is a selection of Europe, Middle East and Africa airports, just to see which are affected most, I guess, and in which parts of the market. It's very interesting when we've done this for Asia. It's obviously very different, and for China, China, there's just so much domestic traffic and it's all booming. Here we see Heathrow lost, this is the international capacity now compared to where it was 2 years ago, so massive loss. But not a lot of domestic, none of these airports really had huge amounts of domestic capacity in the first place. So it's very hard, isn't it?
Very, very hard. And it comes back to some of the discussions we were having this morning for these airports. It's not just international traffic, but what is the mix of your international traffic? Dubai has historically benefited from very high volumes of connecting passengers who were buying and spending quite a lot of money in the duty-free shops. Now they've lost that traffic and all of that revenue has disappeared. They still have international passengers, but they have local traffic to the Indian subcontinent and around the Middle East that traditionally spends less than the international passenger. So in any airport, it's just not the mix of traffic, but it's also where the flows are and their values. And we know Chinese travelers, for instance, historically have spent sometimes thousands of pounds on gifting and bringing goods back to friends and family on their return to China.
Yeah, so with Dubai, it's not always that people visiting Dubai are not spending money, but if Dubai's their destination, they're going to spend it downtown in the shops, not at the airport, aren't they? They're not connecting through. Whereas Singapore is an interesting example, isn't it? Because it had already been trying to become a bit of a shopping destination before the pandemic, and so they've tried to build on that, haven't they? They've tried to enhance their attraction as just a place to go and shop for local residents. So trying to turn the situation around and make something of it. You know, they're nice facilities and nice shops and so on. So there are some airports that can that have opportunities perhaps that are float.
Singapore Changi has tried to position itself as almost like a local tourist destination with its new structures and its facilities. You know, and people would just go out there to look at the waterfalls and the spectacular landscaping. But there are very few airports that have really taken that to hand. I mean, I know, you know, at one stage, Gatwick, I think, was the 12th most popular tourist destination in the southeast of England, which probably says more about what products and the destinations in the southeast of England than anything else.
It's your neck of the woods, isn't it, John?
It is, yeah.
Okay, we've got the same sort of data presented for the Americas. We've got a selection of airports in the US and Caribbean and Latin America. So these US airports, much stronger domestic capacity than we're seeing in many other places. It's still not quite up to 2019 levels, but these are healthy volumes of capacity, and also we're seeing healthy traffic volumes coming through these airports, aren't we?
We are. I think it's probably official now that Florida is sinking from the weight of domestic tourism. You know, not just Orlando, but Miami now has a huge Southwest presence. Fort Myers, Punta Gorda, all sorts of very, with respect to their secondary airports, are seeing these spoke-to-spoke services. Quite low frequency, but ultra low cost carriers coming in the market, stoking up demand. Some of them will succeed and some will stay and some will be short term in nature. But as we've said before, there's never been a better time as an airline network planner to experiment because you've got so many options, such a large amount of spare capacity. It's just seeing what works, and if it works, sticking with it.
So we've talked a bit about some of the things that airports can do, are doing. This is just a sort of a short checklist. There's many other things. Obviously, they're having to make investment in changing things on the ground, and so that they can address some of the health and safety issues. We're seeing a lot of investment in contactless interaction. They're making cost reductions. Some of them are closing whole terminals. Putting staff on furlough or reducing staff numbers. We're hearing many stories of postponing capital expenditure projects. And in fact, we had a question in yesterday in advance of the webinar about what we knew about that and what was happening. I think most of the examples we've heard of are airports that have basically put on hold their capital expenditure projects, with the exception of Hong Kong, which seems to be steaming ahead, doing an awful lot of things while the airport is empty, and it's easy to do those sort of projects.
And easier from an operational perspective as well, Becca. You know, Hong Kong has its third runway very close to being ready. It needed to do this expansion, and there's never a good time to do these sort of things, but when the whole terminal is essentially closed, you know, you can put capital equipment in and do all of the necessary wiring much more effectively and quicker than you would otherwise. So it depends where you are and what your perspective of the future would be. And Hong Kong clearly is going to be a very successful airport in the future. There's a lot of people who will both want to go both there and connect through the airport, and they've taken that step. Equally, Heathrow's closed T4 completely. South Terminal at Gatwick remains closed, although you can be charged for dropping someone off at the terminal, which seems a bit strange. So it's, you know, but a lot of airports have just put things on hold. And then that ripples down, of course, into the local economies. You know, the electricians, the skilled workers who would normally be working on those construction sites are looking for work elsewhere.
And David, you're in Cape Town. You're in that situation, aren't you, where major projects. I think you'd signed contracts, hadn't you? And then it's all being pushed back a bit.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened. We Cape Town, well, AXA planned a big investment in Cape Town. They would have built a new runway, realigned the runway. They would have improved the international terminal. They would have upgraded the domestic terminal, basically doubling capacity at the airport. But AXA in South Africa is one of the better run state institutions or semi, state institutions, and they are reliant on the income and revenue they receive. So it's a bit of a catch-22, because I would have loved it if they could have gone ahead and done these upgrades during this off time, getting ready for when things will pick back up. But unfortunately, they had to push this back now, and the latest I've seen is that they will only consider this again in 4 or 5 years. So it's not a great thing, but I understand that it has to do with how much money you can generate and not putting yourself in a position where you become financially unsustainable.
Yeah. Very difficult decisions, aren't they?
And it is difficult, Becca. And in these regulated environments for many airports, ultimately there is a formula that has to be applied. And at the end of the day, the airlines are the people who are paying for that work, and clearly they do not have the cash at the moment. It is all generally passenger related. There's a bit of rental space you can have and things like that, but most of the costs are passenger related. So the airports are getting no revenue, but if they carried on with that investment, ultimately that would have then implied that the airline's going to have to pay for that at a later stage, just as they're trying to recover demand.
Yeah. No easy answers there, are they? And how do you think, we had a question this morning actually about how the airport experience is going to change because of the sort of health and safety measures that have to be put in place. So for instance, if you're an airport with a lot of luxury brands and retail travel retail products areas and that sort of experience for consumers, how does that change when everything suddenly has to be contactless and health and safety orientated? Are you in Cape Town, are you making those sort of investments to change the way people interact with the airport?
Yeah, so that was actually also one of the earmarked investments beforehand, which they have gone ahead with, and they're trialing a contactless system now for, firstly for South Africans, going through the international terminal, something we don't have in South Africa yet, and I think that's going to help a lot in terms of the health and safety requirements, and it's also going to speed up the processing, and hopefully if it works out, then it will be extended to to incoming international travelers as well. So I think everyone's going to start looking for that. Standing in a long queue, you'll be able to self-help yourself through immigration, which would be great.
Yeah.
Go
on, John.
Yeah, I was going to say, I do think we will see some incredible digital creativity about selling. So, for those luxury goods that are sold in airport facilities, perhaps the personal shopper will be in a video environment with you. And that in some ways might be even more cost effective for the supplier of goods and services. And you would then pick the goods up as you go through the airport, or indeed they will be sent to your home, so you don't have to carry them around with you if you don't want to, upon proof that you did actually board the aircraft and leave the country. So I think we're on the cusp of a change in the way that we think about retail environments at airports, and particularly for those luxury items that people purchase when they're on their holiday. We'll see more planning, we'll see it being done online, and it will be a very different environment.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, John. I wonder, I mean, I don't have an answer, but I wonder how lounges will change, because that's also, I mean, everyone loves their little time they get in the lounge if they're allowed in. So, you know, that will also need to go through quite a hefty change going forward.
Yeah, it will.
And going back to the big projects that airports do you have a sense of, are these projects just being deferred to a later point and sort of pushed down the line, or will airports accept a smaller role, a sort of downsizing of their operation as a result of this?
Good question. Depends where you are in the food chain, doesn't it? I mean, every airport competes for a piece of business. Every airport's got a competitive airport around it. Products and services at the airports can differentiate them and attract customers, be it because they're cheaper and they have low-cost airlines, or because they have a better quality perception at the airport. There's an interesting question from Bernard Lavelle asking about how are airports going to be able to ramp up and cope with that pent-up demand and all of these social distancing needs. And it just reminded me, when we first went into COVID-19, I think there was a calculation at Heathrow that the queue required, if social distancing was observed as was then recommended for something like an A380, was like I think it was about a 3-kilometre queue. And you know, gate areas are certainly not designed for those sort of distances. But it's going to be a really serious issue if the regulatory authorities, control, port health, etc., cannot resource, or we do not put in place the necessary biometric supports and devices that allow people to process through airports as quickly as possible. We're already hearing of 6-hour queues at Heathrow, which may or may not be true. I haven't heard or been involved in any of those.
I saw something about it's taking 15 minutes to process somebody at Heathrow, and yeah. I think it was Heathrow. And you know, if anything, that's the one thing that would put me off travelling. That, you know, however good most of the systems are, if suddenly you're in a contained area with a large number of people from all over the world, that's the last sort of situation that many of us want to find ourselves in.
And you know, we now have Heathrow suggesting that they will refuse inbound aircraft and send them to alternate airfields if they get oversubscribed and the volumes are too big. What does that do for the passenger who happens to be on that flight? You know, they may have had a connecting service and therefore were not even going to be in the country, and because they've arrived at a different destination and are now subject to quarantine, it could be a hotel for 2 weeks at their expense. You know, the whole thing needs to be thought through, and we need to have
John,
a much clearer.
Talking about, you know, you're particularly talking about London, but a lot of this applies in Europe. We had a question from Gary about what's your best guesstimate for when we'll see any substantial uplift in European intra-travel. And I think going back to our point earlier about the Tasman bubble and the trouble of getting demand, meeting demand, when there's no confidence in the market, that's what we're seeing in Europe, isn't it? Or you're more bullish? You think that people are going to travel whatever, they just need to get out now?
I do think there is a breakout mentality, almost like a siege mentality amongst nationalities. But that Tasman bubble experience in terms of that pent-up demand and how quickly it rose and then went back is the most likely shape of recovery I see in many markets. We saw it last summer in Europe, you know, when we had about 6 or 7 weeks when things returned to semi-normal type situations, sudden rushes, and then demand waned because people were worried, concerned.
And what role does vaccination play? We've got a few questions that refer to vaccination, and we always have this. And it's, you know, I've said before, I think that, you know, at the beginning of the year I thought, oh, vaccinations, that'll solve it, but it doesn't seem to be quite that simple, does it? Because air travel's about connecting people with other places with different rules and different approaches. What do you think, John, in terms of vaccination? Does that make a difference?
It certainly makes a difference, but it's only one of the armory of tools that we need to carry with us when we travel. You know, at the moment, you're going to have a PCR test in most cases before you travel. You're going to have a vaccination certificate if it's digitized or however that is administered. You're probably going to have, you know, obviously your passport and your boarding pass. You're probably going to have to confirm that you have a reservation for another test in the country you are going to before you come back. And all of those processes.
My sister-in-law is due here from the States in a few days, and she spent $400 on a test that's supposed to be arriving at my home and hasn't arrived, that she has to do with, you know, after 5 days. And yeah, the process of setting up the test that she needs to be able to stay here, to come out of quarantine, to go back is, it's you know,
the bizarre scenario where you may have to have a Zoom call with a qualified practitioner in a different time zone to prove that you've stuck a piece of cotton wool down the back of your throat and up your nostril, and then put it on a lateral flow test. It's just, we've got to find easier solutions that everyone in the world can use. You know, I mean, we've got people who are specialists in Africa and the African market on this webinar. They will confirm to you that, you know, trying to get those sort of tests in some of the smaller markets in Africa would be virtually impossible.
Yeah, John, I just saw a news alert now that the EU bloc has agreed to open travel to vaccinated travelers from outside. So quite interesting.
But we still have to work out how we can be vaccinated.
It has,
yeah,
but
I don't
you know, David,
how you improve it, but
yeah, David, it goes back to the whole principle of reciprocity, because
yes.
you know, in OAG we've already had press inquiries about what does this mean for US transatlantic traffic to Europe. And the biggest challenge, of course, is that the US is still not allowing overseas nationals into the country, and you know, even those that have exemptions have to go into quarantine. Now,
Yes.
There are very few airlines in the world that can work on the basis of just generating revenues from one area of South. You know, they need to be able to generate revenues from both ends of the route to maximize their revenues and load factors. And until the US issues a similar statement and it aligns with what the European Union says, we're no further forward.
Yeah.
Okay,
No, I mean, I think we, sorry, Becca, I think we would have gotten to it, but that's what we're seeing in South Africa now. The airlines that do fly here, I mean, with a 30–40% load factor, you're not making any money, but they're actually covering some of the expenses with the cargo they're carrying. And we, you know, a lot of them have told us that you know, the cargo is at least giving them some hope in this time.
Yeah. I wanted to move on. We've just got a couple more slides left. I wanted to give you a chance, David, to say a little bit about what's happened at Cape Town with your own air network between May 2019 and today. So I've taken a day. This is from OAG's schedules analyzer from the Mapper tool. On the left, we've got May the 22nd, 2019, and this is today. So the route network, it's looking like you've got flights to quite a lot of places still. Your domestic destinations are almost all back, aren't they?
Yes, domestically, we currently have 12 out of 13 routes back, and beginning of June, we'll get the 13th one back. So domestically, it's going very well. Regionally also, I just had a count today. We had 15 regional routes, and we've got 10 of them back as well. So regional in Africa. But then obviously intercontinental, we still, I think we need about another 10 routes back before we get to our full quota, you know, pre-COVID. So I think we're not doing too bad, but we would like, obviously, most of our intercontinental flights back as well. It's not a bad thing for us now. We're going into our low season where some of the flights are seasonal anyway. We wouldn't have had some of the airlines flying. So we are gearing up for October for when IATA winter hits, you know, to get most of those flights back.
Yeah, so we wanted to focus on, I guess, use you as a case study for, where are the opportunities for airports and for air service development and so on. So we've covered off some of these points, but for you, certainly the winter 21-22 season, that's when you're now sort of looking to, isn't it? And see some opportunities, really. I know when we spoke a week ago, you were saying, Cape Town's a great route for 787s and A350s, and airlines will have some of those they're looking to place on markets, I guess. So there may be new opportunities you haven't had before.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of interest from airlines, obviously, that flew before this, but we also have some interesting opportunities where we've been approached by some other airlines. I mean, obviously, we can't talk about it right now, but a new flight that we will be getting hopefully by November is TAP Air Portugal, which would be a direct flight from Lisbon to Cape Town. So that would open the south of Europe, for us, because we didn't have any route there. And I think it's just, I mean, for us, I think if we continue on this trend and South Africa remains open, then we'll have an edge on most of the Southern Hemisphere competitors. Like you say there, I mean, if Australia is still closed, if Brazil is still struggling, then we've got a great opportunity to capitalize on the traffic that wants to travel south during the IATA winter.
Yeah, interesting. And I was intrigued by the comment you made about Victoria Falls have vaccinated all their residents. So this is where vaccination does play a role, I guess, in tourism, doesn't it? We're seeing a few destinations now take this approach where they say within this particular area we'll vaccinate everybody, and therefore it's now safe for people to come to, and our residents are safe. So quite an interesting idea there. New entrants, we've said all along that in some ways when things are difficult, there's always an opportunity for new airlines. Our final slide after this shows some of the new airlines that we know are looking to enter the market. But you've got Lift, I believe, in South Africa.
Yes, so we had a new entrant that started in December called Lift Airlines, and they've got a very interesting business case. Like you mentioned there, I mean, you can cancel or change your booking up to 24 hours before your flight, and for free. And then if you change it, you just pay the fee price difference, and you don't get your money back, but it's stored in your, they call it the Lift e-wallet, and you can use that as a credit for your next flight. So quite a different, trying to be flexible, trying to, almost, they call themselves the Uber of airlines in South Africa. So, I think the innovation is really working and they're doing very well.
And I guess that for many airports, they're going to be talking to new entrants, aren't they? They're going to be having those discussions, and always, especially when they're new and innovative. I guess those are challenging discussions. I don't know. Do they ask for more? Do they're quite demanding and they want to operate differently? So airports will have to adapt in that way as well. You mentioned freight and cargo, and that's potentially an opportunity, isn't it, for you in Cape Town, where the last 5 years or so of Cape Town Air Access, you focused a lot on the passenger services. There are opportunities going forward, aren't there, for more freight?
Yeah, so we've been focusing on that quite a while now, and I think it's just been pushed, up into the #1 importance during this time. Because we rely heavily on belly freight in Cape Town, we saw a huge uptick in capacity and in demand for air cargo space in the past 5 years. But for us, it's all about creating the environment where people are aware of what's going on, and where the exporters or shippers usually had to truck everything 1,400 kilometers up to Joburg to get it exported. We now have this opportunity in Cape Town to really work on our air cargo capacity, but there's still a way to go, and it didn't help that if you put all your cargo in the belly and you suddenly don't have any flights. You know, we had a huge drop in cargo revenue during 2021. But there's opportunities now, and you know, a perishable center, Cape Town is huge on seafood exports, on flowers, and on fruit that, you know, needs to get to the market quickly. So we're working closely within WESGRO as well, with our export promotion team, to really push this to the forefront.
That's good. So it sounds like you're going to be busy. You're not out of work yet.
No, we're very busy.
So I think this is our last slide. This is just some of the airlines that we know that are starting up, and we know that Rex down here in Australia isn't really new, but they are sort of scaling up what they've been doing. But John, a lot of airlines here. We just mentioned Lift in South Africa, but plenty of others, and we know of other, OAG's getting requests all the time, aren't they, for two-letter codes for new airlines?
Yeah, it's this really is a strange industry, isn't it? Because for all of the trials and tribulations of the last 18 months, and as we've said from early doors in the whole pandemic, never a better time to start an airline. You know, plenty of aircraft, trained employees, crews, some airports slots, even if they're only on an ad hoc basis. And you know, JetBlue have now put their Heathrow services on sale today. So you know, that's just one indicator of airlines, both established and new, are looking to take advantage of the recovery and build out. I would think many of them have been frustrated about how long it's taken to get this far. You know, and some of them still have some huge challenges ahead of them. Pop Air, which is an airline who wants to fly from the UK to India, and specifically Amritsar, might have some challenges. You know, it's a difficult market. North Atlantic, reincarnation of Norwegian. Excuse me. So there's lots of airlines out there who are interested in starting. Greater Bay Airlines in Hong Kong, supported by some of the wealthiest financial institutions and investors in the colony. It's fascinating times. How many of these will still be flying in 3 or 4 years? Only time will tell.
Yeah. So we're just about out of time. We've taken many of your questions all the way through this webinar, and thank you for joining us today. But I just want to take one more question from Karina. The airline-airport relationship in the future, what's that going to look like? And is some sort of innovation needed? So we've got all these new airlines coming forward. We've talked about the challenges for airports, and we know about the challenges for the existing airlines. But what are we seeing for the future of the airline-airport relationship?
David, what's your view from WESGRO? I mean, you're very close to some of those relationships.
I mean, for us, the airlines are ever optimistic. I think we've seen it through this crisis, the conversations we've had. It's just amazing that I mean, all of them have big plans and they want to return and they want to come back with a bang and, you know, even increase capacity. I think in South Africa, it's quite difficult to, you know, to relate that back to how the airports will handle this, because AXA is very constrained in how they, you know, what they can offer at the moment. And I know they are working on, you know, on ways of, you know, maybe offering some kind of incentives or reductions in fees going forward. But it's going to be a long road. And you know, for us, we almost see this. My colleague Paul always says it's a war for routes when we look at the future, and we want to be on the front line, you know, and we want to make sure that South Africa is in the mix when we talk about getting more airlines and getting airlines, you know, flying into our country. So. You know, the relationship for us is going to be the same for quite a while between airlines and airports, but hopefully it can change in future.
Okay, I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you very much for joining us today for OAG's webinar. We will run the next webinar on Wednesday, the 16th of June, and hope you can join us then. Thanks very much. Have a good afternoon. And thank you, John and David, very much for your insight this afternoon.
Thanks, Becca.
Thank you.